Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. This is the last morning of the conference. Hope everybody's all refreshed and had a nice cup of coffee this morning. Today, we're going to talk about visibility and how to generate value from that, in particular around supply chain control towers. So we all know the environment that we're operating in is incredibly complex. And it was complex before COVID, but the last 2 years have created enormous additional complexities in our business. And I like to say that in the early stages of COVID, our healthcare workers, our healthcare professionals were the real heroes. But to a large extent, the unsung heroes of the last 2 years have been supply chain and logistics professionals. As the world locked down and supply chains went absolutely nuts, the world was really close to melting down. And all of you and your colleagues around the world kept supply chains going. It was bumpy and it was challenging, and you all worked incredibly long hours, and you probably still are working incredibly long hours. But food stayed on the shelves, supply chains kept moving, and despite some early shortages of toilet paper, the world got by. And I don't think everybody fully understands how close we were to a real supply chain meltdown in a lot of parts of the world. So I fully appreciate that. And all of you and your colleagues should be very proud of the work that you've done in the last 2 years, literally just keeping the planet moving. So I don't need to tell you about all of these things that have been going on. Now, on a lighter note, the nice part about that is that when I go to dinner parties, people actually care what I do for a living. Like before that, it was certainly not a great topic of conversation. But this complexity, and then when you couple that with new technologies that have come into the mainstream. So there are a lot of technologies that we've been talking about for years and years, but they're finally becoming much more accessible. And every year, Accenture does this a Tech Vision survey of thousands of companies around the world and leaders from all sorts of functions within those companies. And we produce a Tech Vision report every year. And there's some interesting pieces out of the supply chain function in there. And one is around how control towers are becoming an absolutely critical part of businesses. And you wouldn't have found this just a few years ago. It was much more of a niche technology, but it's coming much more mainstream. And then going forward, there's actually a big interest in digital twins, which is a whole other conversation. Maybe we'll come back and do that one next year. So when we talk about supply chain control tower, what do we mean? Everybody's got a bit of a different definition of that. And the definition is not super important, but the way we think about it, it's really bringing connection from a massively disjointed system. And the system is disjointed, not because anything's wrong with it per se, or anybody's done a poor job. It's just disjointed by its very nature. Supply chains, as you all know, span across multiple enterprises. And within every single enterprise, there are multiple functions and silos organizationally. And then there are multiple IT systems within it. So you've got so many different handoffs within a company and then across companies, and you end up with this disjointed mess that you see over on the left-hand side. And a supply chain control tower is really about bringing connection and orchestration across as much of that as possible. So fundamentally, that's what a supply chain control tower is. But what makes it important? What's the important thing to make it work? And this is where I'm going to stop, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this one, because if you remember nothing else, other than that you're all the unsung heroes of the last 2 years, hopefully you remember that. But if you remember nothing else about supply chain, it's these 4 points. And the first one is that supply chain, it's not a plug-and-play supply chain control tower, it's not a plug-and-play technology. What it really is, or what it should be, is a set of business use cases that provide tangible value. And we're going to talk a lot more in detail about what that really means. But it's not just about implementing a technology and then we're done, because that's not how you generate value. The second piece, which also should be obvious to all of you, is it really is about new ways of working. And that's true of any technology. If you implement new technology but keep your old ways of working, you're really not going to improve the situation much. But a robust control tower can really help new ways of working in terms of how the people work together with each other, but also how they work with technology themselves. And we'll get into a lot more detail about that. The third piece is around flexible technology architecture. And it's related to the first point in the sense that it's not a plug-and-play technology. It's not about going out and finding the control tower vendor and buying the system and implementing it. It's actually a whole flexible architecture that has got many different pieces integrated together and is flexible in the sense that over time it will evolve and you'll add different pieces and you'll turn on different functionalities in a much more robust way to support the use cases that we talked about. That's super important. And then the last piece here is that data is the core of this. And we like to say that actually data is the core of any enterprise these days. So it's not just an add-on piece, oh yeah, we need some data, but it has to be at the fundamental, at the core of your strategy, and you need a data strategy. Because without a data strategy, you're not going to be able to get any of the benefits of a control tower. So these are the four things to absolutely remember about how to make a supply chain control tower truly robust in your organization. And they're all related to each other, and they positively impact each other. So the use cases will drive the new ways of working, and that in turn will show you what type of flexible architecture you need and the data that's required, and then it rolls back into additional use cases. So there's a circular motion of all of this. They reinforce each other, but all four pieces are absolutely required to making this happen. So if we talk a little bit more about the use cases, and I'd say that this is probably the area that most organizations trip themselves up when they implement a control tower, is they'll go for visibility. Great, who doesn't want more visibility? But they find they're not getting the results, the tangible business value of the results, because visibility by itself is not enough. It doesn't actually drive business results. It makes you feel better, and it makes your job a little bit easier, but it doesn't always add business value. So we found that the better way of driving value through a supply chain control tower is actually work at the use cases. Now this is just a sample list, so this isn't comprehensive by any means. So the actual list of use cases will be different for each of your companies, and much more extensive. But the key is to work with your business partners, because it's not just a supply chain issue, it's a business issue. And really drive, what are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve here? And what are the use cases, the very, very specific use cases that you're looking to do? And how does that fit along the different segments of the supply chain and the different capabilities of the supply chain control tower? And really focus on a prioritized set of these use cases and drive those, which is a fundamentally different approach than I've seen a lot of companies take, which is much more, oh, I want visibility. And they sort of push that across all there, but it doesn't add the value without the use cases. So absolutely critical is when you're thinking about this, why are you implementing a control tower? Which are the use cases that are going to drive the value? And what you'll find is that there's a long list of these use cases. You're not going to, it's not going to be difficult to find them, but you want to prioritize them and then stay really focused on each of those to drive value going forward. The second area is around the new ways of working. Now, some of this is very obvious in the sense you've got cross-functional teams. Yes, I think we all do that already. Supply chain control towers make that easier, but they're also required. If you have a supply chain control tower and you're not assembling these cross-functional teams, then you're absolutely not going to get value from this. But again, that alone is not sufficient. New skills are really important. I mean, if we were talking about this 5 years ago, how many data scientists would you have in your supply chain? And then how many do you have today? And how many do you think you're going to have 5 years from now? And that's just one skill set. And so the fundamental skill sets, I know a lot of people at this conference have been talking about education, and that's absolutely important, because the types of supply chain skills that people need today are very different than 5 years ago, and they'll be very different 5 years in the future. And so there's going to be upskilling of all of you and your teams, but also bringing new people into supply chain who may not have started with supply chain. And we're finding lots of data scientists, as an example, who are coming in who've never touched supply chain before, but are now our supply chain experts in these companies. The third piece, which I love, is what we call human plus machine. And this is another area where I think people have got expectations that may be misaligned. That they feel like it's either people take these decisions or we automate it, and which is more appropriate. And the real answer is neither. The best answer is human plus machine. How do you make better decisions using human judgment plus the machine analytics? And that's the area where it really makes sense. And the great example of that, I find, is playing chess. If you remember, years ago when IBM put out their big chess playing machine that finally beat the Russian grandmasters, and everybody said, well, the AI chess is going to be the take over. It's like, yes, computerized chess in a very narrow sense is better than human chess. But what they found is that the best combination is a human using an AI algorithm to play chess. So far, that's been the best combination. And so this human plus machine for supply chain, which is even more complex than chess, is absolutely the way to go. But that's a new way of working. There are not that many people who've really embraced that, who've really figured out how to do that. And I would say that that's the biggest missing secret sauce for all of us in the room and all of our colleagues. And then the last piece, there's some new roles that as you develop a supply chain control tower, you've suddenly got visibility over a whole range of activities. And that allows you to have new roles around network planning, and not in a narrow sense, but being somebody to plan at an end-to-end level for a particular customer segment. And it just allows for these new roles that can really drive new values. And those new people in those new roles can do trade-offs between the KPIs, because each of the different segments of supply chain, as you all know, have got different KPIs, and they're trying to optimize different things. So having a control tower that can look across the different parts of the supply chain, but then having new network planners who can look at a customer segment across all the different parts of the supply chain and make those trade-offs is a new role that just, quite frankly, didn't exist before. We talked a little bit about technology, and a couple of key points is, number one, supply chain control tower does need a dedicated system. It can't be the company's ERP system or planning system. It has to be a specialized system around supply chain control tower. That being said, there's also an ecosystem of systems around that, starting at the bottom, where you need a robust platform. And we'll find leading companies, and you all would know this, are becoming much more cloud-based. And that's really critical to be able to scale rapidly in these environments and have much more flexibility than the old systems. And then we talked about data being at the core. So you need systems that will do your data ingestion, your data integration, and your data enrichment. And those aren't necessarily the same thing as your supply chain control tower. And some people mix them up. Some people think, oh, because I'm ingesting data, I've got a control tower. No, that just means you're ingesting data. But it is absolutely, and sometimes people say, well, I've got a control tower software and it allows me to get data. It's like, well, yes, but it's probably not going to get the full range of internal and external data that you need. So you need a whole data ingestion set of technologies. And then you've got the intelligent sense, and what we call intelligent sense and intelligent respond, which is much more the core of the control tower. But you may find there are multiple pieces of software that you need or want to do that. And these can be flexible over time, because what works for you today will need to be adjusted tomorrow. And you need to make sure you've got the ability to integrate a variety of different systems to deliver on the use cases that we talked about earlier. So this flexible architecture is very different than the old school, monolithic large ERP system that needs to do everything and doesn't do anything particularly well. This way allows you to get best in breed for each of the pieces that you need. And then data. I keep talking about data because data is fundamentally important. But I'll throw one bit of warning in here. Actually, the biggest problem that I've seen with data is not necessarily not having enough data, but people wanting perfect data. And they keep studying and they keep working and they try to get the perfect data and they don't realize that perfect data is not going to come. So what you need, you don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. What you need to do is you need to take the data that you can get, you need to work, and this is one of the great things about a robust control tower, is you need to ingest that data and you need to enrich the data. You need to use the control tower and the associated technology around it to identify data quality issues and to, over time, improve the quality of your data and how you enrich it and the insights that you get from that. And so the data quality and the data governance becomes a journey as opposed to a black and white, I have good data, I don't have good data. And that really requires a data strategy. And that's not something a lot of people think about. People think about data as an object. I have data or I don't have data. They don't really think about it as an ongoing strategy. And they don't think about it as something that needs to be governed. But it is. It's like any other process or technology. You need to have a strategy, and you need to have governance around it, and you need to develop it over time. And that'll be absolutely critical to being able to take action on what you have. So what does that give you? So traditionally, supply chain has been focused on one thing, or maybe two things: cost, and the other one would be capital efficiency, which is another way of saying cost. And we all know this because what are our KPIs? What have we been incentivized for? What have our bosses been hitting us over the head or patting us on the back, depending on what the numbers look like? It's around cost and capital. But that's historical. What we realize now is that supply chain in general, and supply chain control towers in particular, actually allow you to go at a lot of other important things that are business outcomes. So the first one to add is at the top right, which is revenue, is that effective supply chains can drive revenue, and not just in terms of avoiding stockouts, but actually being able to service customers in a more robust way that creates new revenue opportunities for your sales channel. And supply chain control towers start to give you that ability, depending on the use cases you deploy, to go after that. And again, depends on the company, depends on your customer segment, but that is a real viable business outcome that you can chase as a supply chain control tower. But what's even more interesting, I find, is on the left-hand side is the strategic value that these can provide to the company. And these are strategic values that are becoming much more important at the senior level within the organization around becoming a data-centric company. Because you can do that as in the supply chain, but that also has spin-off benefits for the rest of the company. Because the better visibility and the better data that you can provide can be used by other parts of the business. And we'll talk about that a little bit in one of the case studies. But it's not just for supply chain. It really impacts on your revenue generation side and on your reporting side at the end. Customers we already talked about, but this is also incredibly useful to have, is that people with winning supply chains can serve their customers better. And so it's not just in terms of revenue. Revenue is good, but we're talking about over here is net promoter scores. We're talking about improved customer journeys, improved customer experience. And we're finding a lot of that is that companies that are really trying to improve their entire business strategically will start with a customer experience journey. And as they go through the customer journey and they go through the mapping and they understand where the pitfalls are, a lot of it comes back to, not all of it, but some of it comes back to supply chain, and some of it comes back to supply chain information. And so the supply chain control tower can actually positively drive your customer experiences. And that ties back into what I talked about at the beginning, the use cases. What are we trying to solve for? And that's where it gets really powerful when you, as an example, when you look at a customer experience, you look at a customer journey, you see where the customer is getting dissatisfied, where your negative net promoter scores are being driven from, what parts of supply chain are causing that. That gives you your use case. You deploy your supply chain control tower with the new ways of working, with the technology. You go after that, you drive your net promoter score up. That's a very different way of looking at it than saying, oh, I want a control tower. I'm going to go contract with this IT company, implement a control tower. I've got visibility. I'm good. Same amount of work effort, but you get to a very different place and very different outcomes. And then the last benefit at the bottom left is around creating a much more scalable and agile enterprise. I think we've all really learned that in the last couple of years, both at the supply chain level, but also at the business level, is that flexibility and resilience are absolutely key. Yeah. Demand fluctuations are all over the map, and your competition is all over the map. And so the companies that are able to scale up, scale down, respond to rapid changes in the market, they're the ones who survive. It's like the old misquote of Darwin about evolution. Most people think that Darwin said that evolution is survival of the fittest. It's not. He never said that. Evolution is survival of the species that can learn how to adapt, is actually what he said. And it's the same with companies. And so how do you make your supply chain much more scalable and adaptable? And it's all of this together. So how do we get there? Well, traditionally there have been two approaches. One is around a set of capabilities. So on the vertical axis, where you start with data visibility and you work up to much more complex capabilities through your control tower. The other way is to start around your products or your markets, your geographies, however you're segmented, and start deploying your control tower along those lines. And both of those work. The problem is the speed to value is not great. It takes a long time to generate enough scale and generate enough of the capability to truly make a difference to your outcome. So you can get there. It just takes you a little longer, which is why we find that the hybrid approach based on business use cases are really the way to go. And so you start with, at the bottom here, you start with specific use case, maybe just one or maybe just a couple. And they're highly focused. They're focused around one or two capabilities and one or two product or markets, and you go deep. And you've worked with your business colleagues to define in advance, what are the business outcomes you're trying to drive? What's the value that you're creating here? And you go deep on those. And you create a quick MVP, you deploy it, you make sure it works, you use agile methodology. There are lots of ways to get at it, but basically you go narrow, you go deep, you go quick, you iterate, and then you build from there. And you do two things. Then you build the next use case, and you expand the first use cases. The ones that work, you expand them, add more capabilities into them, add them across products, add them across geographies, whichever makes sense for your business. And then you roll these out over time. So you get to the same place, but you get there probably faster, but certainly you get there by adding value much more quickly in the short term. So it's a lot more complex in the sense that there are more moving parts, and you've got to be more thoughtful as you go through it, but it's no more difficult. And if anything, it's actually a little bit easier because you're getting the positive feedback of what works and you're getting the negative feedback of what doesn't work, so you can adjust. Whereas some of these other routes, you can actually go quite a long time before you get enough feedback that this is actually working or it's not working. So if this is the approach, there are three different paths to get there. And traditionally, most companies have taken the approach on the right, which is great, is that you start with an in-house implementation. You're all supply chain experts, and you decide that you can create value with a supply chain control tower. So typically, you would work with an outside system vendor, assess which system works best for you, bring it in, start deploying it, start working through, if you want to work through use cases or your new ways of working, you adapt the processes, you deploy it, implement it, and you can get there. But typically, this takes a lot of time because you're doing all the heavy lifting yourselves, and maybe there's a perception that the technology will work out of the box. All I have to do is deploy it. All I have to do is roll it out, and then I'll get the benefit. And then you find, well, actually, that's just step one. So you can get there, but it usually takes a lot longer to get there. So the second area in the middle, which is much more popular, is partnering with a service provider, somebody who does this all the time. And that gives you the benefit of somebody who looks at it holistically, who can help you with the technology selection, who can help you with the new ways of working, who can help you with the data architecture, and can help you with the technology ecosystem, and tailor something that works well for you, but essentially deploy it for you in your environment and to set that up within your supply chain. And that's a very effective way to do it. You're going to get much quicker speed to value with a much more comprehensive approach using a partner. The interesting thing is the one on the left, which we're starting to see more and more of, which is what I think about as control tower as a service. And that's an even more radical concept where companies will partner with a service provider who will actually provide all of this service. And not only will they implement the control tower and implement the ways of working, but they'll actually run the operations. And so the company just needs to focus on the business outcomes. What are they trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? And then to work with the partner to achieve those outcomes. And the partner does the heavy lifting on that. Now that's a small segment, but we're finding that's growing fast. And as we look out, 2, 3, 5 years in the future, I think this is going to be a much bigger part of the market. And that gets really exciting because the time to value on that it can be very short, particularly if you found a partner who's done this work in your segment before. So just a couple of case studies that we've worked with. This one is a large global consumer goods manufacturer, and we implemented a supply chain control tower with them, but in the same way we've talked about, in a much more robust end-to-end fashion. And the interesting thing about this one, two interesting things is one, you look at the metrics across the bottom, and these are big numbers. And when we say these are big numbers, this is a $12 billion company. So you start to apply any percentage to a $12 billion company, and the shareholder value that this creates is enormous. But the interesting thing about this one is that while it was focused on a particular capability around demand planning, it really went much beyond supply chain. It included sales, it included finance, it included the whole thing. And it was really about the resilience and about matching demand and supply, which, as you all know, has become really, really difficult to do in the last number of years. And so the value that creates by getting a better matching of this, particularly for a consumer goods company, is impressive. So this was, again, back to the focusing as a company, not just as a supply chain, but as a company. Where's the value? Where's the money on the table? And for them, it was matching this supply and demand. And so the supply chain control tower was at the heart of it, but it did span the entire organization much further than just supply chain. A slightly different approach here was an oil and gas, we call a super major. So I guess it would be one of the top 2 or 3 oil and gas companies in the world. And for their lubricants business, it was a different approach because it wasn't a supply chain driven project. It wasn't about improving supply chain. It was about a digital transformation for their business. And supply chain became a piece of that. And I'm hearing that a lot, is that people want to digitize their supply chains. Great. But it's even more effective if it's part of an overall digital transformation for the company itself. And so what we did is we worked with them to identify these very specific digital use cases within the supply chain. And there were an enormous number of value-adding use cases. We prioritized them and then had a rapid agile methodology to drive MVPs, multiple MVPs through the supply chain system. So it was a different way of looking at it than the consumer goods, but highly use case driven, highly prioritized, and multiple solutions that together drove it out. So we're still working with this company, and we're doing both. We're adding new use cases and also scaling the existing use cases throughout the system. And this is becoming, not the only piece of digital transformation, but a big part of the core of the digital transformation for this entire company. So with that, hopefully you've all seen, you all know what control towers are. You've seen control towers before. Many of you have worked with control towers yourselves. But I think you'll agree that this is a fundamentally different way of looking at it. It's a much more comprehensive way of looking at how do you capture value in using supply chain control towers. And it's a time that allows companies, it's a tool that allows companies to really generate a whole range of values, from the financial values to strategic values, and really improve their resilience as well as their cost position. So thank you very much for your time. I think we have a few minutes for questions.
So we've got about 8 minutes for questions.
I know that you said the digital twin is a whole different conversation, but I'm just curious to know, what's the difference between a digital twin and a control tower? Because to me, they sound very similar.
They are related, and I think that you can use the data and the analytics that you get out of a supply chain control tower to help feed into a digital twin. The way I think about a supply chain control tower is around providing that connectivity, providing the visibility, and providing the real-time information to allow you to make better decisions and to improve your execution, both in terms of people taking decisions on that or even automated decisions and actions being taken. Digital twin is closely related to that. I think the leading edge digital twins that we've worked with, they'll also ingest information from your supply chain, and they'll create a simulation of the digital twin, sometimes real time, and other times where you can project it out into the future. And what that allows you to do with a digital twin is to make adjustments in the twin and see how is that going to play out in my system. And so you can link it with your supply chain control tower. Use the digital twin as a way to make decisions, not just sometimes about tactical issues, but often about systemic issues. If I change how I'm managing this process, what are the implications of that? How's that going to affect my metrics? And you can simulate it before you actually make those changes real time. So they're very closely linked, and it's a really excited area, especially, and you can get, I get excited about this, but you can get really advanced around that and even link it with IoT sensors in a lot of ways, so that your data gathering becomes real time, incredibly robust, and you can literally see the changes, in front of you and optimize for different things. So it's an exciting area. Maybe we'll come back and have a whole separate talk on that one.
Cool. I think we've got time for one more question.
Thanks for the presentation. Do you mind expanding further on the demand planning aspect where the control tower help in terms of demand planning? What data flow through the system, and what was the source of the data, and how did you integrate it?
Right. So with demand planning, and you've all wrestled with that, I think the most robust demand planning is when you take your internal data and you take external data, and ideally you take market data, completely, how do I put it, unrelated data, and you ingest that all into a system. That's the main part of what the control tower does, is to ingest the different parts of the system. The additional pieces that are important for demand planning is AI and machine learning around that, because that, and I think there was another speaker around that. That's something that we're making great strides in demand planning, so that they're actually use the technology to find the patterns that typically humans have been looking for before, but they're much easier for machines to figure out. And in some cases, actually ingesting completely what you think of as unrelated external data, and in some areas, as an example, weather data affects demand planning for certain goods and services. And so pulling data like that you wouldn't necessarily think of as saying, all right, well, this is my, what my customers are telling me, or what my people are telling me, or what my data is telling me. If you pull in external data that's actually got a correlation with demand, and you put that into your algorithm, that really helps things out. But the big thing is that the more data sources you can pull in, the better. And don't get worried about the perfect data, because demand planning is also, that's another area where the data coming in is really fuzzy, and you just have to, you want to improve that over time, but don't get paralyzed by the fact that you're not going to get perfect data. And then one last challenge that we found with demand planning is that in some ways that's one of the areas where culture change is also more difficult, because you still have a large number of people who believe that they can plan better than the machines. Like, oh, I've been doing this for 30 years. I know how to do this demand planning. And so getting past that with the human plus machine, and how do you build that combination of people with expertise, but then being able to rely on the data and the analytics that you're pulling out of the control tower to come up with the optimum decisions. So that's another great example where the human plus machine comes into play.